Hello and welcome everybody to the ELNET US Zoom. Let me try and do a little roundup for you of this recent week. As ever, a lot going on. On Saturday morning, the IDF successfully rescued 4 Israeli hostages from Hamas captivity in Gaza. Tragically, 1 IDF soldier was killed in the operation. The rescue has drawn praise from the United States. However, it also prompted some fierce criticism from the EU for the reportedly high, but note as yet unconfirmed, number of Palestinian casualties. It's since been revealed by the IDF that a Palestinian journalist and a contributor to both the Palestine Chronicle and Al Jazeera was holding 3 Israeli hostages captive in his family apartment. All 4 hostages are being treated at Israeli hospitals. On Sunday, Benny Gantz announced he was leaving the wartime coalition due to criticisms of Israel's prime minister. In a statement to the nation on Sunday evening, Gantz said, "Netanyahu prevents us from progressing to real victory in relation to defeating Hamas, returning the hostages and confronting the Hezbollah threat in Lebanon." Gadi Eisenkot, whose son and nephew have been killed in Gaza, also left the coalition. Over the weekend, Hezbollah widened its attacks against Israel. The terror group reportedly attempted to shoot down an Israeli fighter jet above Lebanon, reignited a number of fires in the northern Galilee, and triggered air sirens as far south as Nazareth, Accra, and the outskirts of Haifa. Hezbollah drones were spotted above the Israeli city of Nahariya this morning. Israel responded with significant airstrikes against key Hezbollah targets in the south and northeast of Lebanon. In diplomatic news, Secretary Blinken was due to land in Israel today as part of his 8th visit to the region since October 7th. It's also been reported that the US and Saudi Arabia are edging closer to a possible bilateral defense agreement, which could be pursued with or without Israeli involvement. In elections to the European Parliament, which took place at the weekend, we've witnessed a surge in support for the far-right parties in France, Germany, and Austria. This was tempered by strong support for centrist and left-wing groups in other countries. President Macron has called an immediate election for the National Assembly, and Belgium has followed suit. Due to this swing to the far right in their elected representatives to the European Parliament. Overall, Europe's Conservatives, the European People's Party, are on track to secure the most seats of any single group and tightening their grip on the European Parliament. How will all this play out? We will, over the coming weeks and months, keep you in the know on these issues. They matter because Europe is Israel's biggest trade partner, and alongside the US, its most important strategic ally. So that's been a busy and very impactful few days. Let me now introduce our speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Major Andrew Fox. Major Fox served as an officer in the British Army between 2005 and 2021, leaving as a major in the Parachute Regiment. He served in operations in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. He has degrees in law and politics, war studies, and psychology. Having been a senior lecturer in behavioural science at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, he is now a think tank research fellow in Westminster, specialising in Middle East, defence, and disinformation. Andrew, you're very welcome. We're delighted you're able to be with us today. Let me start with a first question. You have said, take a step back, and it looks as if the Third World War has started already. Can you speak to that statement that you've made?
Of course, and thank you for having me, and good to see everyone online. So I think if we look at a little bit of history, if we look at 1989 and the fall of communism and the fall of the USSR, the West fell into a degree of complacency. And what I mean by that is a number of political thinkers were pushing out pushing out tomes like Fukuyama's The End of History, where we kind of assumed that from now on, everything would be liberal democracy, trade would be the benefits, globalization would occur, and it has to a certain extent. And as a result, the West enormously downsized their military forces and focused on kind of much softer influences of power through trade and through influence. And we got very distracted for 20 years with the war on terror, the global war on terror, as the American armed forces call it, where Islamic fundamentalism was the key threat to peace. We entered into wars of choice in Afghanistan and Iraq. Neither war particularly had to happen. Yes, the Taliban needed retribution after 9/11, but what we didn't have to do was go into a 20-year nation building exercise that cost trillions of dollars and hundreds, if not thousands of lives. Whilst we had our eye off the ball focusing on those threats, I think another axis has arisen, and I think we can define it best as a split between democratic nations and autocratic nations, so dictatorships and countries that don't work along the liberal democracy lines that we sort of assumed would be the dominant narrative for the next century. And it's those autocrats that are causing my concerns. And if we start with the various axes that we can identify, Russia is the very obvious one to start with. Might not be obvious if you're thinking it from a purely Israeli perspective, but if you look globally, the Ukraine war is potentially a harbinger of things to come. We've seen Russia seeking to re-establish dominance over their near abroad, the countries that were formerly within the sphere of the Soviet Union. So thinking about Eastern Europe and then the Caucasus and down towards the former Yugoslavia. They've done this through a number of different means. So the first one is very obviously the physical military means. They've invaded Georgia. They've invaded Ukraine twice in 2014 and then in the most recent conflict that is still ongoing. But also they've been flexing a number of other muscles. So they've been using disinformation and influence operations to strengthen their hold over countries like Serbia, and the secession of Republika Srpska, which is part of Bosnia, is still now a threat looming over that region. And if Republika Srpska splits from Bosnia and tries to join up with Greater Serbia, there's a potential for that part of the world to flare back into violence. They've been pushing disinformation campaigns across the West, and essentially they use some of our greatest strengths against us. They know they can't beat us militarily. The United States is still far and away the world's only global military superpower. Nobody can come close to America on the battlefield. But what they can do is leverage things like splits within our societies. They can push disinformation towards alienated communities, minorities, and foster a sense of absolute discontent in the system that runs those countries. That's why they invest money in attacking elections. We've seen that in both Europe and America. They've conducted things like assassinations on British soil. There were the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury in the UK. And what Russia is trying to do is undermine us on an influence scale. And that's why we see things like Wagner being so active in Africa, trying to establish Russian influence there. So they're looking to effectively re-establish a Russian empire. China are the next big threat on the table. So not only are they trying to establish a kind of military dominance over the Pacific and the Red China Sea, but they've also invested in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is incorporating 3/4 of the world's population and a huge amount of its GDP. And what China's doing there is literally buying influence with money and infrastructure and investment. And a new term for this has been coined. So we always used to sort of split power between hard and soft power, but now we're talking about sharp power. And that's what China's doing. So they will invest huge amounts of money into a country. They'll build roads, they'll build ports, they'll build infrastructure. But then that country is beholden to China in terms of influence. And if China turn off the tap or threaten to turn off the tap of money that's flowing in that direction, they can cause serious economic damage to the country that they're trying to pressure. China also huge on hacking, huge on cyber warfare, and then huge on financial investments in sort of buying their influence in countries in the West. So China poses a significant conflict actor And both Russia and China, these are strategic arm wrestles that are already going on, and actually would require very little to push them into a far greater escalation in military terms. And then we can look at the Iranian axis, and that's obviously a lot more relevant to Israel right now. Iran have taken advantage of the Iraq War in 2003. Prior to 2003, the Middle East was pretty stable. Okay, there were sort of the remnants of Arab socialism, where countries were propped up on kind of feeder money from the Soviet Union. A lot of them had developed into polities in a way that had taken hundreds of years in the West. We developed our democracies through a slow process of gradual evolution, whereas these countries quite often were just lines drawn on a map by Western colonizers as they fled. And we generally saw a sort of strongman kind of governmental system that kind of held in check a bunch of conflicting tribes. And they were essentially bought off with Soviet money to stay peaceful because there was a degree of affluence there that kept people happy. What 2003 did was create an opportunity for Iran. Straight away from the invasion, pretty much, we saw a huge influx of Iranian fighters and money into the southern part of Iraq, which is spread to the rest of the country. And eventually, when the Arab Spring happened and when ISIS happened in sort of 2010 onwards, the only way we were able to clear ISIS out was with a militia in Iraq of 250,000 Iranian-backed soldiers who were equal in size and rivals to the Iraqi army. So by destabilizing the Middle East through the 2003 Iraq War, we've given Iran an opportunity to start rivaling Saudi Arabia as the great kind of Muslim power in the area. And we also see that with Israel now. So if you look at the proxies that Iran has been able to fund, they're all in countries that were badly affected by either a civil war or the Arab Spring, looking at Syria, looking at Yemen with the Houthis. And Iran take a very anti-Western view. They don't agree with Western hegemony. They don't agree with Western values and faith. And what they're essentially trying to do is use Israel as the first domino to fall in terms of trying to topple that wider system. And also with them, we see huge disinformation campaigns. And then we get to Qatar, which is the other kind of really malign actor in that block, where you've got Iran pushing the Iranian idea, you've got Qatar pushing the Muslim Brotherhood, which gets its strategic leadership from Turkey, it gets its financial backing from Qatar, and it gets significant support from the Muslim Brotherhood's remnants in Egypt, who were overtoppled by Sisi, but who still remain significant players in Egypt. And we've seen through the tunnels into Gaza just how much supply Hamas have been getting from the Egyptian side of the border. Qataris are dreadful for disinformation, and they're dreadful for flexing that financial muscle. We've seen it, they nakedly bought their way to the World Cup and put themselves on the global scale. They've bought football teams, they've bought huge amounts of property in both America and London. And they use Al Jazeera as their vector for spreading this disinformation. And as a final note, talking about Al Jazeera as a vector, you can see this constantly where the IDF have a tactical success on the ground in Gaza. That will immediately be spun as an atrocity by Hamas, who will then pass the message to Al Jazeera, who will disseminate it. Western media, being lazy, will pick up on that message and run with it. And we're seeing that just this last weekend. And then the disinformation spreads around the world, coupled with a social media presence that's heavily bot or automated. And they will spread hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of messages within a short space of time to amplify that message. And that's very, very heavily Qatari led. And so those are really the four axes. And my thesis is that, potentially we're fighting a war, but it just doesn't look like a war that we expect to see. It's not bombs and bullets, it's information.
But I mean, that is a really overarching and detailed analysis of what's going on, and also quite a frightening one, really, because you've finished where you talked about disinformation. People seem to be so susceptible to it. I mean, I do wonder with the level of disinformation. You talked about how quickly Hamas, Al Jazeera will disseminate fake news about any incident that occurs in Gaza. But the speed willingness with which the Western media perpetuate that fake news, it does make you think it must be more than being lazy. There must be more to that kind of reporting than just being lazy, because we question it all the time. I wonder if I could move a little bit to your analysis, military understanding. Israel has come in for very fierce criticism over the reported number of civilian casualties. And as someone who fought in wars around the world, can you tell us a little bit about the unique nature of the military challenge in Gaza and how it compares to other wars undertaken in recent times? And with this in mind, are these criticisms of Israel, are they fair?
So in terms of the challenges faced on the ground, sorry, my dogs are not supposed to be in here, but they're going loopy. Sorry about that. The challenges they face, right, sorry, give me a sec. Let me just get a grip of this nonsense.
Yeah, go on, sort it out. Is that a first for us to have a dog getting involved in the conversation?
Oh, sorry. My wife had to go get a parcel, and clearly that's a huge threat to the household. So, yeah, we're talking about the challenges militarily in Gaza. I think we're facing something here that I don't think we've really seen before. I don't think I can think of another conflict where essentially the enemy are so embedded in civil populace that they are indistinguishable from conventional civilian targets. Sorry, to civilian infrastructure. Every single school, every mosque, every hospital, every university, every house is somehow connected to Hamas's defensive position, and they've designed it that way. You know, utterly immoral, but actually very clever, because it means that the IDF cannot strike a target without hitting civilian infrastructure. And that's a really awkward position. If you look at what Hamas are trying to do, they are trying to destabilize Israel on a global stage by atrocity farming. That's probably the best way to describe it. They've created a situation where Israel cannot help but hit civilian infrastructure because the civilian infrastructure is the military infrastructure. And that makes pushing a narrative globally of Israel committing war crimes really, really easy. So the IDF are in a real strategic bind there. They either don't do anything and don't hit any infrastructure, or they try and do something and infrastructure is going to get smashed. And I think people don't really understand that distinction. And this is the fact that Hamas have designed their entire defensive strategy this way. If we look at the terrain they're fighting in, 2.4 million people in a terrain that dense is the most challenging military environment you can fight in. There is no harder warfare than urban warfare. And the reason for that is the sheer physical nature of it. So your threat, if you're advancing as a soldier, your threat is 360 degrees in every single direction. Especially when you look at the tunnels, it's even underground. You know, the enemy could pop up from anywhere, disappear again, and you're chasing ghosts, you know, when they're trying to conduct the battle in that way. You can then throw in things like command and control is incredibly difficult. The second a building becomes rubble, that provides all kinds of different cover for the enemy. It becomes exceptionally hard to get across and you know, actually traverse through the environment. And on top of that, you've got things like your map no longer looks like the map that you had at the start of the operation, because half the buildings on it aren't there anymore, or they're rubble, or they're half collapsed. So that's exceptionally tricky. And I think that's reflected in some of the casualties the IDF have had, in terms of, you know, some quarter of their casualties are through friendly fire incidents. And that's just a reflection of how incredibly challenging it is. You don't know where your own forward line of troops is. You know, marking your own people is really, really difficult. And then, of course, we have the wider strategic picture where half the world is telling Israel to stop. You know, the Americans are in a real bind because it's an election year for Mr. Biden. There are states in America that were won by only 21,000 votes, and he needs those electoral college votes. And if he just loses those 21,000, he could potentially lose the entire election. So he's walking a bit of a knife edge between trying to placate his domestic audience and win the votes he needs to retain the White House, versus the fact that he can't just tell Israel to stop what they're doing, because it's a legitimate, legitimate legal war of self-defense. But what that has had the effect of doing is slowing the IDF down. And I think they have just, they've definitely delayed certain operations to make sure the humanitarian piece meets with the Americans' demands. What slowing it down means is that they're effectively giving away their battle plans. They're saying to people of Gaza, look, we're coming into this area, get out. And that blows the element of surprise completely. So I think the IDF is potentially putting its soldiers in much more harm's way than if they just went for it and cleared the positions they needed to. And they're doing that to try and protect civilians, which is another reason why the sort of libel against them is so unpleasant and vicious, because they're being accused of doing the very thing that they're putting their own soldiers' lives at risk not to do. So it's an exceptionally challenging environment to fight in. And I think the IDF have done a pretty decent job so far.
I mean, you've urged Israel not to negotiate too soon. And I think you said it, compared it to avoid repeating the British experience after the capture of Basra in 2004. And you talked about Israel should not, you've urged Israel not to treat their operations in Gaza as a counterinsurgency battle. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, so counterinsurgency doctrine.
Because they're being pressed to negotiate every minute of every day. So
counterinsurgency doctrine doesn't apply here. An insurgency, the definition is something along the lines of a violent insurrection against established authority. And that's what we saw in Basra, that's what we saw in Afghanistan. In Gaza, Hamas are the established authority. They've been ruling the place for 15 years plus. They are absolutely the ruling entity within Gaza. So they're not an insurgency, because they'd be insurging against themselves. It makes no sense. If this was happening in Tel Aviv and it was Hamas fighters, letting off bombs and conducting ambushes, then of course that would be counterinsurgency, and that would be a very different beast. But it's not in Gaza. Counterinsurgency doctrine suggests that the people are the prize. You're essentially trying to persuade people that your version of government is better than the alternative option. But Israel doesn't have that luxury at the moment, because that involves suggesting that Hamas retains some kind of governance or political power. And what I think the IDF are doing is they've split this kind of concept into two. As I said, this isn't really a comparable war to almost anyone that's been fought in recent years. So my sense is that they're trying to remove Hamas from governance. They're trying to remove as much of Hamas's fighting capability as they can. And only then will they attempt some kind of governance solution. The downside of that is, of course, that there's been a war fought through Gaza. And I would imagine that whilst Palestinians were not the greatest fans of Israel to start with, now they will be even more alienated against the Israelis. And so the challenge is going to be finding a governance solution that is acceptable to both the Palestinian people and to the Israelis. And that is a really huge challenge. I've recently seen various day after plans suggested. I'm not entirely convinced that any of them will work. I think it is an exceptionally challenging solution, and that one that is probably going to have to be done over multiple electoral cycles and maybe even multi-generations. There's no quick fix to this solution in Gaza, other than taking a Russian approach to, Chechnya kind of approach, where they just laid Grozny to waste and killed as many people as they could. And the IDF is demonstrably not doing that. So if we take that completely immoral, violent solution off the table, all we're left with is a really long process to try and effectively rehabilitate Palestinians back to accepting Israel's existence as a country, and then hopefully being able to coexist and flourish as mutually, separate organizations.
But to degrade Hamas to the extent that is necessary is going to be difficult, given the pressure that's being applied. And as you say, various elections and lots of other factors come into play and into the decision-making process here. But also, many people, analysts and others, commentators have said, you can't kill an idea. And this Islamic nationalism has a grip, particularly on younger people. we see wherever they get the opportunity across the Middle East to support or vote for it, they do so. How can we tackle that?
I mean, I think we need to
Especially
disambiguate.
given the disinformation you talked about, because that
Yeah.
isn't going to go away, is it? Can I just remind people, shortly you'll be able to put your questions to Andrew. So if you'd like to put them in the chat, you can start doing that now. Andrew.
Yeah, I think we need to disambiguate Hamas from the broader kind of Palestinian independence movement. I think there's two very distinct idea groups and behaviors and attitudes in those two things. It's it's not something I'm going to offer a solution to, because it's a 75-year problem, and if I had all the answers, then I'd be a lot richer than I currently am. But I think Hamas can be deleted. We're not trying to kill an idea, we're trying to kill Hamas in this situation, if I'm the IDF. And that is entirely possible. Now, are you going to kill 100% of them? Almost certainly not. But can you degrade their fighting capability to a point where they can no longer maintain their governance? That's the question. We're not trying to just wipe them off the face of the earth. We're trying to make it so that they do not have their stranglehold over Gaza anymore. Once that stranglehold is broken, then we can address the second half of your question, which is the wider Islamic fundamentalist Palestinian independence piece. And that's where we can then start looking again at a two-state solution if we decide that's the way forward, or work out what a one-state solution is going to look like. And again, I don't have the answers to that. But I think it's really important that the world understands that Hamas cannot be allowed to retain governance capability. What they did on 7th of October was so beyond, I don't know if the word is the pale. I've been to those sites in Israel, and I struggle for the words to describe them. The people that did that cannot be allowed to play any kind of role in the Middle East.
I know you went to visit Israel, didn't you? Not
Yeah, back in April.
After. What were your kind of thoughts? And I mean, it was I've been myself. It is very shocking, but
Yeah.
from a military perspective, what were your thoughts about how this occurred, how this happened? Because much is said about the shock that Hamas were able to do exactly what they did.
I mean, even just talking about it now, I'm getting a sort of prickle on my skin. It was so mind-blowing. I mean, I've done 3 tours of Afghanistan, all of them in combat roles, and I've never seen anything quite close to what they did in Kibbutz Be'eri. The reason it happened, I think, I think we do have to give Hamas credit in the sense that they planned it exceptionally well. I'm not putting a moral value on that at all. But
do you think we should view them as I've heard this phrase, a terror military, that people view them as a group of terrorists, and that somehow implies, yes, terror, but not an organized army?
No, they were absolutely organized. The organization on 7th of October was remarkable. The detail of planning and organization that went into that. So if you look at, even in the run up to that, their entire aim was to convince Israel that Palestinian Islamic Jihad were the threat and not Hamas, and that Hamas were domesticated, if you will. The reconnaissance that went into it, using some of the 18,000 Palestinian migrant workers that went into Israel on a daily basis, the level of detail they had on each kibbutz to know where they needed to strike first, the armories of the defense organizations and the houses of men who had guns. The fact that to get through 5 levels of security fence, they needed properly worked up engineering teams, combat engineers. We would absolutely recognize the techniques and tactics they used in a Western army. It was incredibly sophisticated. And then as soon as they got into a kibbutz, what they did was get high, set up anti-armor ambushes. That meant that the IDF response was incredibly badly degraded, because they needed tanks. This was, objectively an incredibly well-planned operation, albeit in the cause of the utmost evil.
I've got 2 questions so far at the moment, who are very keen to put them to you. I'll come back if we have more time. First of all, can I ask, I'll ask David Siegel. David's president of ELNET US. So welcome, David. Would you like to put your question to to Andrew.
Thank you, Joan. It's an absolutely fascinating conversation. Major, thank you for joining us. It's a great honor for us. We follow you on social media, and it's wonderful to hear you firsthand. I have a question about the bigger picture. So it's clear that Israel's facing not just a war in Gaza. Unfortunately, there's a war in the north or something short of war. It's unclear how that ends. There seems to be this mantra that if you close one file in the south, immediately you close the file to the north, and 61,000 people happily go home after 19,000 rockets were fired at Israel in 8 months. And then above that is Iran, that is on the threshold of nuclear weapons. So can you say a word about sort of what we should expect moving forward? Is this a forever war? Is this something that Israel will need to face for many, many years to come? Is that our necessary assumption? And therefore, what does the Western alliance do about this? Does Israel really have allies, both in Europe and the United States, with staying power to see us through this? Because this is not going to end tomorrow, and it won't end even with the elimination of Sinwar, if that day ever comes. So if you can say a word about the bigger strategic picture. I'll just ask you also about, it's clear that China and Russia are both using the Middle East as diversion tactics from Taiwan and Ukraine. So there's obviously a larger picture here as well that involves Europe and Israel directly. So just a few words about the bigger strategic situation that we're in. Thank you very much.
Of course, and thank you, David, for those kind words. They're very much appreciated. I'll deal with your final question first, if I may. I think as you say, the distraction from Ukraine and from Taiwan is deeply serious, and that really is where I think my Third World War concept will escalate if it does. I think those are the places that perhaps could draw significant amounts of NATO into a contact battle. China will be watching Ukraine like a hawk, and probably watching Israel like a hawk as well, to see how the West reacts, to see the level of commitment to their allies that NATO has, and dare I say it, the US as well.
And I'll get your back, okay? Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.
Because the US, to be absolutely blunt, is not having the greatest record as an ally in the last few years. If we look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where we essentially threw our allies under a bus, and I'll say we because it was a NATO effort. If we look at the lukewarm support that Mr. Biden's been given to Israel because domestic considerations are taking priority. If we look at actually some of the slow support to Ukraine that's been given from the US and from other European countries as well, we haven't done all we could to help the Ukrainians achieve victory. So if I'm China, I'm looking at this situation and I'm making very calculated strategic decisions as to whether or not, if I invade Taiwan, I'm going to get away with it or not. And I will be conducting entirely similar information operations to try and attack the will to fight of the West, so that when it comes to pulling the trigger in Taiwan, the reaction to any response is negative and in the way that China would want it to go. So these things have to be seen in conjunction. There's strategic information battles that undermine the West's will to fight at the same time as they're escalating their intent to fight us. Now, going back to your first question, in the wider strategic picture around Israel, it's not a happy situation, frankly. Looking at it again objectively, I'm not Israeli, I'm not Jewish. I don't really have a dog in the fight, other than the fact I believe in democracy and I believe in supporting our allies. And I think Israel is a force for good in the world generally. The northern front is going to be challenging. Hezbollah are far more capable than Hamas. They're better armed. They've got huge amounts of combat experience from the civil war in Syria. So their fighters are battle hardened, and their tunnels are potentially even more impressive than Hamas's, which are no mean feats, of their own. Yeah. They could be even better in Lebanon. Added to the fact that the IDF, of course, is a reservist army. So the force numbers they would need to cross the border into Lebanon and drive Hezbollah back over the Litani so that they're out of anti-tank range, so that Israelis can move home. In a sustained campaign, that's going to be phenomenally expensive. And of course, there's also that 3-month mobilization rule as well, which means they'll have to keep rotating brigades through, probably taking significant casualties. And with no guarantee of success. So it's a really tricky battle. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a huge softening up of that Hezbollah fighting capability. The IDF are hitting absolutely everything they can from the sky, because what Hezbollah don't have is an air force or even particularly good anti-aircraft weaponry. So Israel has free rein with the Israeli Air Force to destroy as much as they physically can before even the slightest suggestion of a ground maneuver campaign starts. But I do think that Gaza, certainly the kinetic phase of the Gaza operation, needs to be resolved before Israel opens up a second front. Like one of the classic axioms of war is that you don't fight a war on two fronts. And it would be deeply foolish, I think, to try and do anything in Lebanon before Gaza is, certainly ramped down from the kinetic clearance phase that we're seeing at the moment. But then you look at Iran and their intentions. My understanding is that they could achieve 5 nuclear weapons in 3 weeks should they decide to ramp up their uranium production. The sort of the silver lining to that is the fact that the Israelis are pretty well infiltrated in that program. Their response to the Iranian missile attacks in April were to hit sites right next to the nuclear sites. So it was a kind of "we know where you are" message. And should Iran show that desire to start ramping up a uranium production, I think we could see a pretty swift Israeli response, and probably one that's backed by most of the West as well, because we have no interest in seeing Iran become a nuclear power. And in terms of Western backing and Israel's allies in the region, I think in spite of all the criticism that I've just made about perhaps lukewarm support, and in spite of all the criticism Israel's had from their partners, I think it's really interesting that the Abraham Accords are maintained. I think it's really interesting that Jordan opened their airspace so that Israel could repel rocket attacks. The British and the Americans didn't play a huge role, but we were there, and we were there to help the Israelis defend themselves against that rocket attack. So whilst the condemnation is savage of what the IDF is doing in Gaza, I think in the broad strategic picture for the region, we understand how important Israel is. They've been an ally on information sharing. We buy and sell weapons from each other. It's a pretty critical piece of real estate as far as the West is concerned, and it's better that Israel run it than anyone else. So whilst there is an existential threat, I think, to Israel, we can't underestimate that. Every sign I'm seeing is that if it really comes to the crunch, Israel's allies will still be there, but we need to make sure that that is maintained because, as I've said, China's watching.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, David. Can I now call on Jean-Louis Velez? Jean-Louis, I think you have a question for Andrew. Major Fox.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
can hear you.
Oh, hello. Thank you. Andrew, thank you so much. So I did have a question. As you know, as we all know, the area is littered with a bunch of failed states, civil wars, autocratic leaders, and democracy has never really taken root in most of the area. Are we naive in thinking that even if a two-state solution was obtainable, that there'll be any kind of stability, that the Palestinian people can govern themselves?
I mean, potentially, there are certainly Arab states that we can look to as exemplars in how to behave like grown-ups on the world stage without trying to actively undermine your neighbors. I have huge criticisms of countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I find certain elements of their lawmaking immoral, and certainly some of their behavior has been not ideal, but they are still just about in the grown-up space where we can do business with them. There's no threat militarily from them. And, whilst they might occasionally do things like dismember a journalist, it's something we can tolerate in exchange for a degree of stability. And I think that's probably the goal for Palestine, I would suggest. Whether that's achievable in Palestine now, absolutely not, would be my opinion. As I said, I think it will be a multi-generational effort to get them there. And of course, it all revolves around the fact that they need to accept Israel's existence. And that's the huge stumbling block here. That's the reason there's a 75-year-long conflict, is that one side cannot accept the existence of the other. they've turned down deal after deal after deal to get their own state because they want it all. So in terms of once we're past that point, there's every chance that we could achieve something in Palestine that is at least tolerable, if not acceptable. But we need to get past that stumbling block first, and that's the real challenge as I see it.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Did you can say?
I was just going to make well, thank you for that. I was just going to make one. The Gulf states, of course, have the immense privilege of billions of dollars of oil revenues. That changes their calculations and their ability to appease their people. I think a Palestinian state is probably closer to Syria or Lebanon in terms of sort of makeup and governance.
Yeah, that's possible. I know there's enormous amounts of resource under the seabed just off Gaza's coastline. That might be something that can be leveraged to get them to a place where they behave like human beings rather than animals and start trying to conduct things like 7th of October. And I think we also have to consider that Qatar is sat on a huge amount of oil and they don't behave particularly well. So I don't think the oil status is a guarantor of acceptable behavior. But it all depends on what the reconstruction of Gaza looks like. You've got some big selling points there with the undersea natural resources, with the fact that they've got a huge bit of coastline, which means they can trade, and they can look across the Gulf and see how other countries are doing it. And as long as they can accept Israel's existence, there's no reason they can't be another UAE with the resources they're sat on. I think they need to be weaned off Qatari money because Qatar comes with obligations and hidden agendas. So there's got to be a Gulf solution somewhere to effectively buy compliance and create a society which is affluent enough that people no longer feel resentful. But it's, like I said, it's a huge, enormous project. And I don't have a quick, easy answer for you on that one, I'm afraid.
Can I go to Dr. Jeremy Havardi now? Dr. Havardi,
Thank you.
Would you like to
Hi.
put your question?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Major Fox, Andrew, and a great presentation. And the question was really, in order to ensure that the remnants of Hamas cannot ever again govern Gaza and threaten Israel, does the IDF have to retain some military control over the territory of the enclave, perhaps splitting it into zones, as with the West Bank, in order to help a future civilian administration?
Yes, and I think that's exactly what they are doing. If you look at the Netzarim corridor that splits Gaza just south of Gaza City, it runs west to east, bisecting that terrain. Every indication is that is there to stay. They've just paved the road, and I've speaking to IDF contacts. I know that they've embedded facial recognition software, fiber optic cable. That is a serious piece of kit that's not there on a temporary basis. So I suspect that is an enduring location. And then, of course, we've got the Philadelphia corridor down in the south. A little bit politically more sensitive because the Egyptians are deeply upset about that for a variety of reasons. They're twitchy anyway about Israeli forces on their border. And on top of that, there's a political embarrassment waiting to happen when the scale of Egyptian support for Hamas becomes clear. So that's a little bit harder to maintain, but I suspect if I were Israel, I would be finding a political solution to enable me to have that military option. And then I think what we're probably going to see is a raiding capability. And we've had a couple of kind of clues towards that in the last few weeks. There was the second, maybe third, Al Shifa raid, where they launched from the Netzarim corridor and they were on objective in 15 minutes. It was an absolutely remarkable piece of freedom of movement. And freedom of movement was something I was concerned about, actually. I thought there might be a really big insurgency where we saw a Basra kind of repeat, where everywhere they went, there'd be IEDs and RPG ambushes. But we're not seeing that, which is really interesting. And I think that potentially speaks to the level of dislocation that the IDF have achieved in Gaza City of Hamas. They've been forced to disperse, and it's been really challenging for them to operate because every time they pop their heads up, there's another IDF operation that's on the ground in 15 minutes to take the battle to them. And they had a really big loss on that Shifa raid. That was an absolute treasure trove of intelligence and kind of command and control decapitation for some of the Hamas elements and PIJ elements in Gaza City. And then, of course, the hostage raid this weekend, another great example, a remarkable piece of military planning. And I doff my hat to the IDF planners. That really was superbly planned. Everything I've seen of that, it was absolutely textbook stuff, even down to the reaction and the reinforcement when the unexpected happened and a vehicle stalled and Hamas started closing in. They had their contingency plans absolutely swept up. It was deeply, deeply impressive from a military perspective. But that gives us, I think, a flavour of what the IDF are going to be doing in future, probably alongside the reconstruction. And what that looks like is clearly still to be decided.
Thank you.
I think we have Rachel Goodstein. Rachel, are you there? Hello?
Oh, I'm here.
Hi, Rachel. Would you like to put your question to Major Fox?
Just any suggestions on how we can combat disinformation, either individually or leveraging media we subscribe to or something, because it's really out of hand. It's frightening.
Yeah, I agree. I've been researching this for a few months now, and some of my findings are pretty scary in terms of the scale of this. The bots alone, over a 2-day period, they can have millions and millions of impressions on social media, and it's something that humans can't combat. So I think it's a two-pronged attack that we need to make on disinformation. First of all, we need to address the psychological side of things. So we need to be holistic. We need to look at those cognitive flaws that make us so prone to believing disinformation. I can go into a little detail on those, but I don't want to bore everyone with a psychology lecture. But essentially, we make 35,000 decisions plus a day as humans. It's physically impossible for each of those decisions to be rational. Therefore, our brain leans towards easy decisions that it can make automatically. And when a disinformation campaign is targeted at your emotions, that's something that doesn't generally require rational thought. So people get carried away with their emotional response. That's why Hamas are using so many pictures of dead children in their propaganda, because it generates and guarantees the emotional response they want that overrides your rational brain. So there's an education piece. We need to make people understand that people are trying to manipulate them. There's an active disinformation piece where we're going to have to look at ways that we can counter this faster than we currently do. At the moment, even over the weekend, great example, the Hamas storyline was out there right from the word go. Even before the final Israeli helicopter had taken off, stories of a massacre were already going like wildfire around the internet. And the IDF were pretty quick with their response, but it was too slow. The narrative was behind them. So I think we're looking at AI solutions to kind of catch it almost as it's out of the pitcher's hand, so that you've intercepted it before it gets out, and find a way to match that spread of disinformation. And it's really tricky because democracies don't really engage in this stuff. We do a bit. Every war comes with propaganda on both sides. That's just part of war. But what we don't do is this large-scale bot disinformation campaign in the way that the autocratic states do. They exploit our freedom of speech. They exploit our kind of liberalism when it comes to saying whatever you want. Whereas if you try to say it in their countries, you'd probably find yourself, inside a jail cell or worse. So, we've got these inbuilt flaws that they're exploiting, and that's what we need to counter. So it's an education piece, and there's a technological solution as well that we're still working on to try and counter this stuff before it spreads like wildfire. But it's really tricky. There's no easy answer again. Sorry.
Great question. Thank you, Rachel. Can I go to where am I just doing it? Larry Hochberg. Larry Hochberg's one of our founder and chair emeritus of ELNET US. Larry. You're on mute, Larry. No, you're still muted. Randy, can you unmute Larry?
All right. This is
We just got you.
It's a little bit off the mark, but as long as we have you, especially, Joan, with all this commotion about Hamas and the Palestinian state and this and that, Why is it so silent about the Kurds, who have more people, less land, more responsible? Why is that not on the agenda anywhere? I'm just curious as to your view, more or less, more than Mr. Fox's. But what do you think about all that?
Andrew?
So
you go first.
I think the Palestinians have the advantage of 40 to 50 years of Soviet Union, KGB, deliberate disinformation operations backing them up. If you look at Arafat coming in as essentially a KGB agent, they've conducted absolutely textbook subversion on behalf of the Palestinian people. They've changed the language used. They've targeted the far left in Western countries, and that's who we're seeing. You know, the same people that are protesting Israel are the same people that would would go for Antifa, that would go for all the traditional hard left wing causes. And they were pushing an open door when it came to Gaza, because the ground had already been seeded for this narrative that they were pushing, of Israel being a colonizer state, of Israel committing genocide, etc., etc. It was already there. Whereas the Kurds and the Syrians, who have had 600,000 civilians killed, or the Sudanese, who are currently undergoing an actual genocide, again with heavy Qatari subversion, which is, they're once again given a free pass for the way Qatar has been behaving in the Sudan and Eritrea regions. They don't have the benefit of that, and so they don't make the headlines, and so they don't get the attention and the support that, frankly, they deserve from the global stage.
I wouldn't argue with that. I think it's absolutely true. I don't think the Kurds have had the same powerful friends. I don't think the Kurds have themselves wanted to pursue the kind of agenda that Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, all manipulated and backed and founded by Iran, are willing to pursue. I don't think that's part of their agenda. And they've been so dispersed that they became part of the countries they were in, and then those countries have turned on them. There's a big Kurdish population here, Andrew, as you probably know, and they saw themselves as Turkish at one point, but I don't think that's the case now. Okay, so I think we've got time for another question before I hand over to our chair, Tom Flesh. I'm just going to call Eli Elishimene. Eli, are you there? Hello.
Yes, hi. I've really enjoyed your analysis, and I'm going to ask you a question that may be outside your area of expertise, but I'm curious what you think. What do you think about the changes that are taking place in government in Israel now? People who are resigning and the kind of changes that are taking place. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as you say, I'm not the best person to comment on Israeli internal politics, but I can give you a kind of what I think the impact might be, which is probably more in my lane. Also, as an aside, as a non-Israeli, trying to observe Israeli politics is absolutely fascinating. It's a very complex beast. I think Netanyahu is in a real bind here, because he needs to keep America sufficiently on side that he doesn't sever that link. That would be the ultimate disaster for Israel, if the link with the United States and the huge amounts of aid they get from the US, if that was severed, then Israel's in real trouble, frankly. So Israel, Netanyahu has to keep that part of the equation happy. He also has to keep his own coalition together. So he needs to keep the Ben Gvirs and the Smotriches happy, or as happy as they can be. And what I think has happened is the more moderate voices are now falling in the middle between those two chairs. Obviously, Gantz and Mr. Gallant will have their own agendas as well. They will have their own political ambitions. I wouldn't care to speculate on what those are. But the really big military implication is that war cabinet needs to give a very clear end state to what Gaza looks like, and then make a decision on what happens in Lebanon. And it requires a degree of stability, and it requires a very, very clear piece of direction to the IDF as to what they are actually being asked to achieve. I think they've done brilliantly so far in creating a military operation that gives them the ability to flex one way or the other once the politicians make their mind up. I think they're working to a broad overall intent, and they've done it very effectively with the huge manpower constraints that they have. But the real danger here is that that very clear required end state gets lost in the political mess as they're trying to sort out who is the war cabinet and, you know, who takes part in it. Whilst Netanyahu is juggling his various plates that he's trying to keep in the air. So yeah, I think it's, in terms of the military output, Israel just have to be very careful that they don't lose sight of the fact they're fighting a war in the midst of all this sort of internecine disagreement.
Thank you, Eli, for your question. Thank you, Andrew. It's been an awesome session. I'm going to hopefully meet up with you again soon so we can talk further. I think there's other involvements we could have given the overlap of our sphere of interest. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Tom Flesch, who's chair of ELNET. Tom.
Thank you. Am I unmuted? Okay.
No, you're fine.
Thank you. Joan, this was a wonderful presentation, and thank you for coordinating Major Fox, I'm really impressed with your background and your experience, and having participated in so many different engagements with coalition forces. I can only imagine behind the scenes, the discussions that they were planning, extensive planning that's involved. I'm just curious. Well, I'll take an example. Just the missile defense to the Iranians launching of missiles to Israel. The defense by the coalition forces that participated, and it was the UK that we saw. It was Germany and France and the United States, Israel, Jordanians participated, the Saudis participated. And I suppose the messaging on something like that is quite substantial. It was not in secret, it was not veiled, it was right out in the open, and there was a commitment. And it was a commitment to protect Israel, Jews, or democracies. I think that we're talking about all of them. And so how difficult is it for you to coordinate all these coalition forces to keep the will to fight and to keep everybody on board to go in the same direction and keeping their eye on the objective? Is really my question.
Yeah, I mean, from a military perspective, I was only a major. I was never a general, so I never had to worry about that sort of thing. And actually, I think it probably sits more at the political level than it does the military level. The unifying purpose for the whole thing was the fact that whilst clearly there are protests in the West about Gaza, and the Palestinian cause is very much in the activists' mind. I think it was a clear indication that the countries involved do see the bigger picture. Whilst they might be upset with Israel for the way it's conducting operations, whether that's fair or not, never mind. But the fact is, when the chips were down, we know who the enemy really is, and we know that the enemy is Iran. And I think we should be more open and overt about using that terminology as well. These autocratic states are our enemies. They want to destroy us. The fact they don't have the capability yet is by the by. These are malign actors on the international stage. So to coordinate something like that would be reliant on kind of your pre-existing agreements and arrangements. It's very easy for the Brits and the Americans to work together because we do it all the time. Anyone under the NATO banner, that command and control and coordination, again, is pretty easy because, we've been flexing our muscles in Eastern Europe just in the last few months with huge divisional level rollouts. So there are command structures in place. The tricky part would have been bolting on the Gulf states and sort of the regional Middle East actors, but there's a way to sort of minimize that friction by front loading the actual combat power onto the countries that do it together all the time. So the fact that Jordan opened their airspace, the fact that Saudi were on board and gave their agreement, that's political level coordination that was really effective. And it was all because there was a very clear unifying purpose to make sure that Iran was repelled.
So thank you for that answer. The discussion today was amazing, very insightful. Major, you might not know this though, but the work at ELNET, it is really, since October 7th, the demands on what we do have increased extraordinarily. I say we have already a queue of countries wanting to send delegations, and we're trying to accommodate them all. So we've been very successful, even evidence of the number of people participating from around the world on this call today. Our numbers are increasing every week, so there is really an appetite to see what we're doing, and people are supporting what we're doing. I just want to say to the viewers that are on this call that we are doing our best to respond to all the requirements and all the needs that are being made from us, and this comes at a great deal of expense. And we've been raising money, we're feverishly raising money just to make sure that we just keep this momentum going. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all those that are on the call today for their support, and call on them to continue their support, increase their support, get other people involved, because what we're doing is very effective, and it's evidenced by just Major Fox being on this call today and explaining and giving us these insights. So we're doing a good job, and we need participation and support from all our viewers and all our supporters. So I hope we'll have another occasion to speak with you, Major, and it has been very insightful, and I want to say thank you very, very much, and welcome to our group.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I'm really grateful for you asking me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Major. We hope to see you again very soon in our programs. Thank you very much.
You know,
thank you, Joan. It's a great
David,
discussion.
David, for those who are interested in supporting it, they can go online. They respond to however they got onto this call, or they can look us up on our website. But it's important to get our sponsors. And I don't know, Jay or David, if you want to give information about contact information, because I don't know where all this is being broadcast to right now.
Yeah, everything is on our website, and it was also, I think, on the Zoom, but we will make sure that everyone gets that link again. And please join us. We need your support. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'll be in touch, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Okay.